As many of you know, earlier this year, a helicopter crashed in California, killing 9 people. One of those killed was NBA superstar Kobe Bryant. In a matter of seconds, the candle of those 9 lives was snuffed out. I want to share a story with you this morning about Kobe Bryant. I share it with you not because he was a perfect person. He certainly was not. In fact, there are times in his life that even he would say were well outside the bounds of what he ought to have chosen. Many stories emerged about Kobe after his death. One such story is related by Kristen O'Connor Hecht, and I'd like to read it for you. She writes, "I was a staffer at the Phoenix Hospital. My husband, Tom Hecht, was then an exec with the professional basketball team, the Phoenix Suns. A pediatric cardiologist I worked with asked me if my husband, Tom, could get an autographed something from the Los Angeles Lakers or from Kobe Bryant himself. For a 5-year-old dying patient who was also named Kobe. You see, young Kobe was from one of the reservations in Arizona where basketball is life. I called Tom at the Phoenix Suns, making the request, believing that there would be virtually no way this could happen. The Los Angeles Lakers were coming to Phoenix to play the Phoenix Suns later in the week. A day later, Tom called me and said, he'll do it. I was thrilled and thought I would bring the ball or whatever other autographed item to the hospital for little Kobe. No, he read your story and he wants to come meet the little boy. I was floored. The next day, a limousine brought Kobe Bryant to my office. Under a cloak of secrecy, neither the security nor PR people were informed. And I got in a little trouble for this, but it was so worth it. The 3 of us scrambled up a back staircase to this little boy's room in cardiac ICU. For the better part of an hour, they played basketball, passing it back and forth with little Kobe laughing, his sweet mama smiling and laughing as well. Several autographed items were left and many photos were taken. The machines keeping the little boy alive were dinging and whirring and alarming, and his docs were just grinning from ear to ear. As Tom and I stood nervously nearby watching this unbelievable scene unfold before us, as we got back into the limo, Kobe turned to me and said, Kristen, what can I do to help? Is it a financial thing? Because I can take care of that. It wasn't. The little boy had a heart defect that was too ill for a transplant. I was floored. I was floored not only because of his sincerity and offer of generosity, but the kindness and warmth he displayed. Little Kobe passed away the following week. About 3 weeks later, I got a letter from little Kobe's mother describing the power in those moments. She said those were the most joyful moments of his entire life. The photos were the only photos she had of little Kobe smiling. According to Kobe Bryant's PR people, he did this everywhere he went. But the deal was no PR. Does this remind you of some of Jesus' miracles, where he healed someone and then said, don't tell anyone? No PR? Have you ever wondered why some miracles that Jesus performed got so very little attention and others were contested and questioned? Allow me to set the stage for you. The first century was a very difficult, tumultuous, violent time for the people living in Israel. The Romans were the empire that was occupying the Holy Land. To rub salt in the wounds of the Israelites, the Romans had renamed the land Palestine after the Philistines, the one nation that Israel could never defeat, just so they would never forget the Roman Empire. Rome, in turn, hated the Israelite religion because it gave them hope. Hope that the Messiah was going to come and conquer their oppressors and liberate them. So the Romans were always on the alert for the possibility of this coming Messiah. For thousands of years, the Israelites had been looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, but the question always persisted. How will we know if the person performing the miracles is really the Messiah, or are the miracles being performed by the Antichrist, by the power of the devil? So with careful study of Isaiah 35 and 61, 4 miracles were brought out that could only be performed by the Messiah. These became known as the 4 messianic miracles. Every person that claimed to be the Messiah was watched closely to see if he would perform any of these miracles. Today, Stacy and I would like to explore these 4 messianic miracles, giving some background for them and why they were contested by the religious leaders.
So here's Jesus starting to do miracles. You can imagine that when this man from Galilee began performing miracles and raising a following, the religious leadership of the day began to watch closely. The first miracle that we will explore is the healing of the leper. Now, leprosy in Bible times was a very serious ailment that was thought to be a punishment from God. It likely was not limited to our modern definition of leprosy, but instead involved a wide variety of issues, which they were called defiling skin diseases. The book of Numbers, Leviticus, and others describe them in detail. In fact, Leviticus chapter 13 has a large list of defiling skin diseases that the priest had to diagnose, with correlating actions to take depending on the diagnosis. It's interesting that many of the actions involved isolation. We might be familiar with that term today. We call it quarantine. In most cases, the very contact with someone with leprosy was cause enough to make that very person unclean. So it's interesting to note that when the Bible talks about curing someone of leprosy, they refer to it as cleansing instead of healing. Leviticus chapter 14 outlines what the leper needed to do once he was cleansed. The end result was that he had to go to a priest and offer various sacrifices. It was a very serious event. Do you remember earlier when I mentioned that leprosy was considered a punishment from God? Why would that be the case? Well, to the Jewish priesthood, the Bible seemed to indicate that it was indeed a punishment of God. The first instance of leprosy mentioned in the Bible involved Moses himself. It's found in Exodus chapter 4. Then the Lord said, "Put your hand inside your cloak." So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. "Now, put your hand back into your cloak," he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. So God is clearly the one who is seen as the cause of this affliction, and God therefore had to be the one to remove it. The second case noted in the Bible is with Moses' sister Miriam. It's recorded in Numbers chapter 12. Remember that Aaron and Miriam were complaining about Moses' leadership at this time, particularly as it involved his wife Zipporah. Miriam was apparently the instigator, but God called all 3 of them into a special powwow outside the tent of meeting. Moses, Miriam, and Aaron all got a good lecture from God, and when the smoke had cleared, Miriam had leprosy. Aaron begged Moses to ask God to heal her. Moses did so, and God ended up healing Miriam. The common denominator again, it was God that caused it, therefore only God could cleanse it. Now, other stories of leprosy in the Bible might bring to mind Naaman the Syrian. He was healed through the power of God by the prophet Elisha. However, according to Jewish rabbis, there were no instances of leprosy being cleansed among the Hebrews. That, they thought, could only be accomplished by the Messiah. Again, God gave it as a punishment. Only God or his Messiah could fix it. So with that in mind, you can now perhaps see that in Jesus' day, having leprosy was considered more than just a mere medical problem. And now we come to Jesus. He's going about town preaching, teaching, healing, and I can imagine that the Pharisees initially may have just had a partial interest in this peculiar guy. But then we get to the story recorded in Matthew chapter 8 of Jesus healing a leper. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." Several things are interesting here. Large crowds are following Jesus, yet a leprous man somehow gets close enough to kneel in front of Jesus and ask to be cleansed. Not healed, cleansed. Remember that they felt this was a punishment from God that only God could take away. In so asking, this man likely recognized that Jesus could be the Messiah, someone who could cleanse him from leprosy. So with all these people around, Jesus says the word, and the man is cleansed of his ailment. Then he tells the man, "Don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses had instructed." Why would Jesus tell this man not to tell anyone? Could it be that the man's clothing perhaps covered his leprosy and no one in the crowd was aware of who he was? Maybe he came in disguise. That's really the only way the crowd would have let him in their midst. Boy, lepers and social distancing were a thing back then. Remember that if they had even touched him, they would have been unclean. So I think it's probable that the crowds didn't even know what had happened. And now Jesus' instruction begins to make sense. The ruckus it would have caused for the crowds to suddenly realize that a leper had been in such close proximity to them, that would have been immense. The outcry that this man didn't follow social distancing would have likely been many times worse than what you might experience at the grocery store today. Now imagine that you are the priest in the temple, and in walks the first cured leper in the Jewish history. He asks to be checked out according to the Jewish law. I suspect that the priests had to consult their scroll for the first time ever to see what was going on. Leviticus chapter 13 and 14 would have been written for exactly this moment in time. This helped identify the Messiah. It also opened the eyes of the religious leadership that something peculiar was going on in the land.
In response to the first messianic miracle of healing a leper, an intensive investigation of Jesus' messianic claims began. It is evident that the leadership of Israel would return to Jerusalem and decree the movement of Jesus as significant. After this event, he began to undergo the second stage of interrogation. Between the performance of the first messianic miracle and the second messianic miracle, everywhere Jesus went, a Pharisee was sure to follow. This time, they were no longer silent. They started asking questions or raising objections. They were trying to find a basis for rejecting or accepting his messianic claims. The second miracle we are going to talk about is the casting out of the mute spirit. Now, the casting out of an evil spirit was not an uncommon thing in the first century. If a person was possessed with an evil spirit, they could be brought to the synagogue or the temple, and the leaders of Israel would speak to that person and ask the evil spirit, "What is your name?" Then they would call out the spirit by that name. Jesus himself used this formula in the story of the demon-possessed man in Luke 8, verse 30, when Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And the man replied, "Legion, because we are many." So this miracle would not have raised any eyebrows. In fact, there were more concerned about the pigs than this miracle. But what if the evil spirit held the person's tongue so they couldn't speak? Then there was no way to cast the evil spirit out, and you were out of luck. You would have to deal with the evil spirit until the day you died. But in the Gospel of Matthew, we have 2 recorded instances in which Jesus cast out a mute spirit, and the responses are unbelievable. Matthew 9:27-33. After Jesus left the girl's home, 2 blind men followed along behind him, shouting, "Son of David, have mercy on us." They went right into the house where Jesus was staying, and Jesus asked them, "Do you believe I can make you see?" "Yes, Lord," they told him, "we do." Then he touched their eyes and said, "Because of your faith, it will happen." Then their eyes were opened and they could see. Jesus sternly warned them, "Don't tell anyone about this." Instead, they went out and spread his fame all over the region. When they left, a demon-possessed man who couldn't speak was brought to Jesus. So Jesus cast out the demon, and then the man began to speak. The crowds were amazed and exclaimed, "Nothing like this has ever happened in Israel." Did you catch that? Nothing like this has ever happened in Israel before? Then we have the story in Matthew 12:22-23. Then they brought him a demon-possessed man who was blind and mute, and Jesus healed him, so that he could both talk and see. All the people were astonished and said, "Could this be the Son of David?" The people understood the significance of what they had just witnessed, and they were saying, "Could this be the Messiah?"
So now we've seen 2 specific miracles that the Jews considered could only be done by the Messiah: healing a leper and casting out a demon who couldn't talk. The 3rd messianic miracle was considered to be healing someone with a birth defect. Now, the Hebrew sages believed that birth defects like leprosy were a punishment from God for the sins of the child or his ancestors. Who could forgive sins? Only God, of course. They therefore reasoned that since it was a punishment from God, only God or his Messiah could correct that birth defect. Very similar to their belief about leprosy. So now let's turn to John chapter 9, where there's a very interesting story that you probably know by heart. But I wonder if you might have missed the true significance of this story prior to this. As he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" "Neither this man nor his parents sinned," said Jesus. "But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Jesus is now ready to really set the record straight. The local belief was that being born blind or having a defect from birth was a result of the sin of the parents or the individual. Now, how an individual could have sinned in utero before they were born in order to cause them to be blind at birth doesn't make sense to me. But Jesus was indicating here that it wasn't the sin of the parents or the individual that caused the blindness. Instead, Jesus seems to say this is going to be a great teaching moment. What you're about to see is something of great significance. Then Jesus proceeds to spit in the dust, and with the resulting mud, refashion this man's eyes, reminiscent of what happened in creation back in Genesis. And the man is healed. Of course, it was the Sabbath. The townsfolk soon see this man and couldn't figure out what happened. Then word gets to the Pharisees, the religious leadership, and they begin to seriously investigate. This Messiah thing has just reached a tipping point. First, the Pharisees question the man. "What happened?" they ask. "Well, this guy put mud in my eyes and now I can see." Some of the Pharisees don't believe it. "What?" they say. "It was the Sabbath. Anyone who does something like that on the Sabbath isn't keeping the Sabbath. He can't be from God." The Bible tells us, though, that some Pharisees thought it unlikely that a sinner could perform such miracles. So now they pull his parents into the mix to get to the bottom of the story. I love this part. You can sense a lot of frustration built up on both sides here. "Is this your son?" they asked. "Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it that now he can see?" "We know he's our son," the parents answered. "And we know he was born blind, but how he can see now or who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age. He'll speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Did you catch that last sentence? The Pharisees were already at a point where they were threatening to excommunicate anyone who acknowledged that those first two miracles that happened by Jesus indicated he was the Messiah. Leprosy had been cleansed. Some townspeople had reported that he had cast out a mute demon. It was getting a little too close for comfort for them. They know that this Jesus guy had already accomplished 2 of the 4 messianic miracles, and now possibly healing a man from birth defects. That's 3 of the 4 miracles that only the Messiah could do. They needed to quash this Jesus character soon. So you can sense their frustration in the final exchange they have with the blind man. They keep bombarding him with questions, and he seems to get a little bit snarky in his response. But what does he have to lose? Can you blame him? He's just had his life handed back by the Messiah. Then they, the Pharisees, hurled insults at him and said, "You are this man's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, but he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this the Pharisees replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out. This man recognized that nobody had ever heard of someone healing a birth defect. Only God could do that. The Pharisees could see it as well. This was the 3rd out of 4 messianic miracles, and they knew they had to act quickly, or this whole Messiah thing was going to get out of hand.
The 4th messianic miracle was raising someone from the dead who had been dead for 3 days. Once again, we need to explore Jewish culture and tradition to understand what was significant about raising a person from the dead after 3 days. The Jews believed that when a person dies, their spirit remained with the body for 3 days. The dead person could, they believed, be raised back to life within that 3-day time period. However, after 3 days, decomposition would set in and the spirit would leave. So raising a person from the dead within 3 days was not a significant enough miracle to be considered a messianic miracle. In fact, Jesus had raised many people from the dead within that 3-day time period without causing much reaction. But to raise a person from the dead after 3 days was only a miracle that God himself could do. This brings us to the story of Lazarus in John 11. So Mary and Martha sent someone to tell Jesus, "Lord, your dear friend Lazarus is sick." When Jesus heard this, he said, "The end of this sickness will not be death. No, this sickness is for the glory of God. This has happened to bring glory to the Son of God." Verse 6. Yet when Jesus heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. Then, after the 2 days, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let's go back to Judea." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, not long ago the Jews wanted to stone you to death. Do you really want to go back there?" Verse 11. Then he said, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but now I will go and wake him." The disciples said, "Lord, if he's sleeping, he will soon get better." They thought Jesus meant Lazarus was simply sleeping, but Jesus meant Lazarus had died. So he told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. And for your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, for now you will really believe. Come, let's go see him." So Jesus and the disciples leave where they are and head to Bethany. As Jesus draws near Bethany, Martha goes out to meet him. She is quite distraught and says, "Lord, if you had only been here, he wouldn't have died. But now it's been 4 days." Martha is expressing the cultural belief. But then in verse 22, she expresses faith. "Even so, I still believe that anything you ask of God will be done." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Jesus has a similar encounter with Mary. Then Jesus asks to be taken to the tomb. Upon arriving there, Jesus commands that the stone be rolled away. Martha protests, "Lord, there will be a smell. It's been 4 days." Jesus responds to Martha in verse 40. "Remember I told you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" They removed the stone, and Jesus lifted his eyes towards heaven, praying, "Father, I am grateful that you have heard me. I know that you are always listening, but I proclaim it loudly, so that everyone here will believe you have sent me." After these words, he called out in a thunderous voice, "Lazarus, come out." Jesus had just completed his 4th messianic miracle. This would seal many people's belief that Jesus was the Messiah. But what would be the reaction to this miracle? Verse 45. That was a turning point for many of the Jews who were with Mary. They saw what Jesus did and believed in him. But some went back to the Pharisees and told on Jesus. The high priests and Pharisees called a meeting of the Jewish ruling body. "What do we do now?" they asked. "This man keeps on doing things, creating God signs. If we let him go on, pretty soon everyone will be believing in him, and the Romans will come and remove what little power and privilege we still have." Verse 53. In that moment, they submitted their intentions to have Jesus executed. Let's move to the next chapter, John chapter 12. In the first part of John chapter 12 is recorded the story of this feast at Simon's house, when Mary, who had been forgiven much and now has her brother restored to her, out of the gratitude of her heart, anoints Jesus with a costly perfume and wipes his feet with her hair. Verse 9. When the word got out that Jesus was not far from Jerusalem, a large crowd came out to see him, and they also wanted to see Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. This prompted the chief priests to seal their plans to do away with both Jesus and Lazarus, for his miracle testimony was incontrovertible and was persuading many of the Jews living in Jerusalem to believe in Jesus.
Jesus was most certainly aware of the Jewish expectation that only the Messiah could perform these 4 miracles. Remember when John the Baptist sent a couple of his own disciples to Jesus? They asked him if he was the Messiah or if they should wait for someone else. And he answered and said to them, "Go report to John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have the gospel preached to them." Jesus is quoting out of Isaiah 35 and Isaiah 61, the very verses that Matt told us about at the very beginning of this sermon. Those were verses the religious leaders were using to identify the miracles that would reflect the coming Messiah. John and any Jew would have recognized that immediately. Remember that the man born blind knew the significance of his healing in relation to understanding who the Messiah was. The Pharisees saw these signs also. Within a few short days of Jesus raising Lazarus, the Pharisees would seize the opportunity to put Jesus to death. The one person who was able to fulfill all 4 of those miracles, that was one they just couldn't have around. It's clear that their intent was never to watch for the Messiah. If it were, they would have been anxiously checking off miracles as Jesus performed them. Instead, they used the pretense of protecting their religion to maintain the status quo with the Roman Empire. Anything like a Messiah that would upset the apple cart with Rome would likely cause them to lose power in their relationship and support with the Romans. While the townsfolk were longing for leaders to overthrow the Roman oppressors, the religious leaders wanted anything but that to happen. And the evidence seems to indicate they worked hand in hand with Rome to keep peace in the region. So you can imagine that when this man from Galilee began performing miracles and raising a following, they needed to watch. It's clear from their actions again that they weren't keen to see the Messiah come because of the ramifications it would have on their control of society. You know, Jesus did stuff that didn't always make sense to us. When he was in Galilee, he didn't tell anyone he was the Messiah. But when he went to Jerusalem, he told everyone that he was the Messiah. Why did he perform some miracles in Jerusalem that he wouldn't do in Galilee? We suggest it's because Jesus was self-aware. He understood the community around him. He understood the politics, the religion, the demographics, the geography. He knew that people were expecting different things in different parts of the country, and he operated accordingly. We can learn from Jesus. We can learn to minister to the culture in which we live. It's not always about what we want. It's about how we can minister with Jesus to reach the very people in our community. In his culture, in his environment, the cross was the only possible solution for someone who could only claim to be the Messiah, but prove it with the 4 miracles as well. For Jesus, even knowing that, he gladly took his place on that cross as our Messiah, as our Savior, and our Redeemer. The Bible is chock full of fascinating stories that can assure us that everything Jesus did while on this earth, he did for a reason. Many times he explained that reason as a fulfillment of prophecy. He knew what he was doing when he performed the miracles of the Messiah. Jesus fully intended to die for us, knowing that his actions, the miracles he was performing, were going to seal his fate. Today, in this time of desperation, in this time of uncertainty and confusion, we can rest assured that he knows what he's doing in our lives now. Take comfort in that. What an amazing God. Father in heaven, we thank you for the gift of the Messiah. We thank you for the lessons in the Bible that pointed to that very fact that Jesus was the Messiah. He is our Savior and he is our Redeemer. We ask, Father, that as we explore the Bible, as we study deeper into lessons, we'll learn deeper lessons. We'll learn to appreciate you more, and we'll learn to figure out how we can relate to the community around us. Father, this is a strange time we're living in, and I ask that you will just bless us as we adapt. Help us to fit into this culture, fit into this time, and reach people for you. And let the people who hear these messages, Father, be comforted in knowing that you are with us all along. In your name we pray. Amen.